The rifle cracked once. 800 meters away, a man dropped out of a third-floor window like his strings had been cut. Nobody on that rooftop moved. Nobody breathed. Then Corporal Tyler Dawson, the man they'd called the best shot in the battalion for 2 straight years, turned slowly and looked at the woman kneeling behind him with the rifle still pressed to her shoulder. The woman nobody had ever looked at twice. The communications specialist. The quiet one with the wireframe glasses and the regulation bun and the job description that didn't include this. She lowered the rifle, checked her breathing, said nothing. And in that silence, every assumption every person on that rooftop had ever made about Staff Sergeant Emma Collins collapsed like a building with its foundation pulled out. This is her story. And I promise you, you will not see what's coming. If this already has you, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment below with your city and your country. I want to see how far this story travels, like the video. And stay until the end, because what happens in Fallujah will change everything you think you know about who the most dangerous person in the room really is. The fog came off the Carolina coast every morning at Lejeune like it had somewhere to be and changed its mind halfway. It sat low over the PT fields at 0545, thick enough to blur the tree line, and by the time the formation broke at 0610, it was starting to burn off in slow patches that made the pine trees look like they were materializing out of nothing. Staff Sergeant Emma Collins ran the last quarter mile of the 3-miler at the same pace she'd run the first, not because she was showing off, but because she had long ago trained herself to negative split every run by default. Her father's discipline: start controlled, finish strong. Never let anyone see you working harder than you have to. She crossed the finish mark and peeled left without breaking stride, letting her breathing slow on the walk back toward the comms building. Around her, the formation dissolved into the usual post-PT drift. Guys gravitating toward the water station, guys gravitating toward each other, the specific social physics of a Marine battalion reassembling itself from a collective physical effort back into its natural hierarchy. Emma didn't belong to any of those gravitational centers. She never had. She was aware of this the way you become aware of a low-grade noise after living with it long enough. Not painful, not even particularly bothersome. Just present. Part of the landscape. She finished second overall in the run. She knew this because she'd been counting cadence and watching feet. Nobody else knew it because nobody had been watching her. That was fine. That was in fact the arrangement she preferred. Collins. She turned. Gunnery Sergeant Derek Kane was cutting across the gravel at an angle that meant he'd spotted her and was intercepting rather than searching, which meant he had something specific. He had a clipboard under one arm and the expression of a man running on his 4th cup of coffee and declining patience. Kane was the kind of NCO who had been in long enough that his face had stopped doing anything unnecessary. He gave information. He received it. Everything else was overhead he'd eliminated. Change of schedule, he said, arriving in front of her without slowing until the last second. Qualifying range this afternoon. All hands. Captain wants updated marksmanship jackets before we deploy. What time? 1300. Full qual. Standards apply. He was already turning. Make sure your comms team knows. Roger, Gunny. He was gone before the second word was out. He didn't make eye contact. He rarely did, with her. Not hostile. Just the particular brand of professional non-recognition that accumulated when you'd spent long enough being correctly invisible. Kane saw her as a function, a reliable one. That was the whole picture. Emma adjusted the weight of her PT gear and kept walking. Around her, the base was waking up into its daily operational rhythm. Vehicles moving, ranges running somewhere in the distance. She could hear the faint percussion of M4 fire from the training area, carried on the morning air in fragments. The smell of gun oil and wet grass, and the specific institutional cleaner the Corps used on every surface, in every building, on every base she'd ever been on. She'd been at Lejeune 14 months. Before that, Camp Pendleton. Before that, a communications billet at Quantico that was as unglamorous as it sounded and exactly as technically demanding as she'd hoped. 4 years of service, 2 deployments prior, one to Kuwait, one to Okinawa, both administrative, both the kind of billets that filled out a service record without generating any particular story. She was good at her job, genuinely good, The kind of good that becomes invisible because it looks like things just working. Radio systems didn't fail when Collins maintained them. Frequency plans didn't have gaps. Net synchronization happened on time and stayed stable. When there were problems, she found them fast and fixed them faster. And the officers she worked for wrote competent evaluations that accurately described what she did and failed entirely to capture how well she did it. That was fine too. She had chosen this lane deliberately, and she maintained it deliberately, and she was not, on most days, anything other than settled in it. On most days. The qualifying range sat at the eastern edge of the training area, bordered by pine on 3 sides and open sky on the 4th. By 1300, the sun had moved enough that the 300-meter targets were in partial shade from the tree line, which threw off the visual contrast in a way that separated shooters who relied on optics from shooters who understood light. Emma drew her lane card, signed for her M16A4, and settled into position in lane 7. To her immediate right was Private First Class Marcus Webb, 19 years old, nervous hands, and the specific tension around his jaw of someone trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous. Click, click. The safety on his weapon, going on and off. "Webb," he startled. "Staff Sergeant?" "Your safety." She didn't look at him. She was running a bore check on her rifle, tipping it toward the thin light from the range's overhead panels. "Pick a position and leave it." "Sorry, Staff Sergeant." The clicking stopped. "Also, your rear aperture is set for 200. We're shooting to 500 this relay." He looked down. His ears went red. He made the adjustment without being told twice. Emma finished her bore check, verified the 0 card on her kit, and settled in to wait. Down the line, Corporal Tyler Dawson was doing what Tyler Dawson did, which was to generate a gravity field. People moved toward him without fully deciding to. He had that quality, the physical confidence, the easy laugh, the certainty that read as warmth from a distance, even when it was really just a very well-maintained performance. He was holding court with Corporal Reyes and 2 privates Emma didn't know by name yet, telling a story with the practiced timing of someone who'd told it before and knew exactly where the laughs landed. "So I'm at 600 meters, maybe a little more. The wind is doing something weird off the ridge line, and I put the first round right through the 10 ring. Rangemaster thought the target had a defect." A grin. A beat. "It didn't." Laughter. Emma heard all of this because she was 5 lanes down and the range was quiet before the relay started and sound carried. She didn't react to it. She was watching the target frames at 500 meters, the way they sat against the tree line, calculating the shadow gradient and the thermal differential she could already feel coming off the asphalt path that ran behind the firing line. She heard Dawson's voice change direction, which meant he'd turned toward her lane. "Comms is shooting today?" Not addressed to her directly, addressed to the general vicinity, which was somehow worse and somehow completely characteristic. Reyes said something she didn't catch. Dawson responded at a volume designed to be heard. "I just didn't know support staff ran through the whole qual course now. Thought they did the abbreviated version." Emma's hand moved to her rear aperture, 2 clicks right. She'd noticed the wind coming slightly from the northwest, 6, maybe 7 knots, shifting in 2 to 3 second cycles. She filed the timing. "They have to shoot somewhere," someone said. "Sure." A pause that managed to be indulgent. "Just saying, different skill set. Nothing wrong with it." Webb, beside her, had the look of someone waiting to see if he should say something. He glanced at Emma. She was checking her support arm position, elbow placement, the angle of her wrist. "Focus on your front sight," she said, without looking at him. He did. That. The relay ran in 3 stages. 200 meters standing, 300 kneeling, 500 prone. Standard qualification course, the same one Marines had been running for long enough that it had stopped being remarkable to anyone who'd been in more than 2 years. Emma had shot this course 11 times in her career. Her worst score was 231. She settled into the prone for the 500-meter stage, with her cheek welded to the stock and her breathing already cycling into the pattern her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to fully understand why. 4 counts in, hold 2, 3 counts out, shot brakes on the empty lung. Not because that was the only way, because that was the way that had been built into her nervous system at an age when nervous systems are still being written and it was now as automatic as blinking. The targets flipped up. She found the first one, let the crosshairs settle, read the wind. The 6-knot push from the northwest wanted to walk the round 2 to 3 inches right at this distance. The thermal from the asphalt path was a minor upward push, maybe an inch at 500. She accounted for both without conscious calculation. Just an adjustment, a correction. The way you correct your steering on a road you've driven 1,000 times. She fired, hit. She was already moving to the second target. She finished the relay with 8 rounds, all 8 on paper. 7 in or immediately adjacent to the scoring rings, 1 slightly low that she'd noticed immediately. She'd anticipated the thermal wrong on that one, overcompensated slightly, and that she would fix next relay. When the score sheets came back, Staff Sergeant Briggs at the scoring table looked at the numbers, looked at Emma, and looked at the numbers again with the expression of a man whose calculator is showing him something he didn't expect. Collins, 243. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Briggs wrote it down. No comment. The silence around the notation had a texture to it. Dawson had shot a 236, which was good. Genuinely good. The kind of score most Marines would be satisfied with and some would brag about. He'd already been quietly accepting congratulations from Reyes when Briggs called Emma's number. The congratulations stopped. Dawson looked at the sheet, then at Emma. The expression he wore was one she'd seen before, not on ranges, but in boardrooms and lecture halls and anywhere that a confident person encounters information that doesn't fit their model of the world. He was doing the recalculation, the one that starts with error and works its way reluctantly toward anomaly. Huh, he said. That was all. Just, huh. Lucky grouping, Reyes offered. Emma was already breaking down her weapon. Bolt out, carrier group, a quick wipe of the bolt face. The motions of someone doing something they've done 10,000 times. Maybe, Ortega said from further down the line. He was watching Emma with the quiet attention of someone who was actually paying attention, which put him in a very small minority at that moment. Emma finished her breakdown, racked the components into the case, and signed out with Briggs. Nobody asked her anything. Nobody said anything to her at all. She walked back to the comms building and spent the remaining afternoon troubleshooting a frequency sync issue on an AN/PRC117 that the previous operator had blamed on a hardware fault. It was a software configuration error. She fixed it in 11 minutes. She logged the repair as routine maintenance. She did not add her name to the report. Emma Collins had grown up in a house at the edge of a valley in central Montana, where the nearest neighbor was 4 miles away and the nearest town with a grocery store was 17, and where her father had installed a 600-meter range in the back field when Emma was 8 years old, because, as he'd explained it with the deadpan logic of a man who saw the world primarily through the lens of practical application, distance doesn't care how old you are. William Collins had been a lot of things in his career. Sniper instructor, SOTIC graduate, Force Recon, then Special Operations, then the kind of operational role that doesn't get a title in official documents. He'd retired as a master sergeant with a service record that was about 60% classified, a body that had been rebuilt in pieces by military surgeons over 15 years, and a reputation in certain communities that had eventually earned him the call sign Ghost. Not because he was quiet, because his shots appeared without warning from distances that shouldn't have been possible and left no trace of where he'd been. He was also Emma's father, which meant that her earliest memories included lying in the prone beside him in a frozen Montana field at dawn, learning to read the way frost vapor moves differently than morning mist, because it matters, and because paying attention to the world is how you survive in it. She had learned to calculate bullet drop before she'd learned to parallel park. She had learned to account for Coriolis effect before she'd taken the SAT. She had spent her entire childhood being trained by one of the best long-range precision shooters in a generation, and then she had gone to college, gotten an engineering degree, joined the Marine Corps, and systematically ensured that none of that showed. Not out of shame, not exactly, out of the specific, stubborn need to know down in her bones, that whatever she built in this uniform, she'd built herself. Without her father's name as a footnote, without people looking at her and thinking, oh, of course, William Collins' daughter. She wanted to be known for the work she chose, the systems she maintained, the discipline she'd built without anyone handing it to her. So she went into communications, and she became the Marine nobody noticed. Her apartment off-post was small and deliberately spare. A desk, a bookshelf that was mostly technical manuals, and a few paperbacks she'd read on deployment and kept because throwing books away felt wrong. A kitchen she actually used. She cooked real food, nothing elaborate, but actual food, because eating well was one more thing she could manage correctly when nobody was watching. On the wall above her desk there had been a photograph until about 6 months into her Lejeune billet. Her father, standing at the edge of a ridgeline in Montana with his back to the camera, a .300 Win Mag over his shoulder, looking out over a valley 3,000 feet below, like he was making a decision about it. She'd taken it down after the third time a Marine dropping off paperwork had stopped, looked at it, and said, "Is that Ghost Collins?" She'd put it in a drawer. She hadn't looked at it since. What she had, instead, was routine. PT work. The technical satisfaction of complex systems running correctly. The particular private pleasure of knowing something nobody knew she knew. It was a small life in some ways, and in other ways it was exactly what she'd designed it to be. Clean, contained, and hers. What it lacked, she had mostly stopped noticing. Mostly. 3 weeks before the deployment orders were signed, she drove to a self-storage facility outside Jacksonville that she'd been renting for 4 years without going to. The unit was paid by automatic transfer from an account her father had set up, and she'd never closed. She'd told herself more than once that she should probably cancel it, figure out what was in there, deal with it. She'd found reasons not to. Not denials, or not only denial. More the specific reluctance of a person who knows that opening a door will change something and is not yet ready for the change. The door rolled up. Inside, sealed military-grade containers stacked neatly along one wall. A climate-controlled cabinet she'd installed herself when she'd set this unit up, and then never returned to. A rifle case, long and black, with the combination she'd been given at 17 and had never forgotten. And on a shelf near the back, a USB drive taped to a sealed envelope with her name on it in her father's handwriting. She'd known the envelope was there. She'd just never been ready. She stood in the middle of the unit for a while, not doing anything, just standing there in the afternoon light with the dust moving in the air around her and the rifle case sitting on its shelf like a fact she had been declining to acknowledge. Then she closed the door and drove back to base. She didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. The stress shoot happened 10 days before deployment. Command had added it to the pre-deployment training schedule. A combined event, run to shoot, which meant 400 meters of sprint carrying full kit, and then a cold shooting position with targets ranging from 300 to 500 meters, and a time standard that was designed to be achievable for a well-prepared shooter and punishing for anyone who'd been coasting. The difference between a qualification range and a stress shoot is the heart rate. Everything that looks clean and controlled at 60 beats per minute starts showing its cracks at 160. Trigger control, breathing, sight alignment, they all degrade under physical stress, and the only way to maintain them is to have trained them far enough below the threshold of conscious control that they survive the degradation. Most Marines had trained them somewhat below that threshold. Emma had trained them somewhere else entirely. She ran the course in the third wave. She was not the fastest. Ortega edged her out by about 4 seconds, which she noted without concern, but she came off the run controlled, heart rate already dropping because she disciplined her pace at the end of the sprint rather than emptying the tank, a choice most people didn't make because it felt wrong and only felt right after you'd understood the math. She went to ground. 5 targets. Mixed distances. The range master called the time standard. She put 5 rounds on 5 targets. Not perfect. Her second round was slightly low because her breathing hadn't quite completed its first cycle and she'd let the shot break half a count early. But all 5 in the scoring zone. Her time was clean. Briggs read the results. Kane, standing at the back of the range with his arms crossed and his expression providing precisely nothing to work with, let his gaze move across the scores without visible reaction until it reached Emma's. Something happened in his face then. A very small thing. A slight adjustment around the eyes. The kind that meant data had arrived that didn't fit the existing model. He looked at Emma. Emma was clearing her weapon. He looked back at his clipboard. Dawson's score was posted. It was good. It was very good, actually, considering the stress conditions, and he received the response he expected, which was appreciation from the people around him and a satisfied nod from Kane. Then Emma's score posted. Dawson read it. Then he read it again. The energy around him shifted in the small way that happens when a person encounters something they've been categorizing as irrelevant and suddenly aren't sure. "She's in comms," Reyes said, like this was an explanation. "Yeah," Dawson said. He didn't say anything else, but for the first time he was watching her when she walked off the range. She didn't notice, or maybe she did, and it didn't register as significant. She had work to do. There was a deployment in 10 days, she had frequency plans to finalize, an equipment manifest to confirm, and a team to prepare. She also had a decision she hadn't yet made. She went back to the storage unit that night. This time she opened the envelope. 3 pages. Her father's handwriting, left-leaning, precise, each letter formed with the particular care of a man who understood that communication was just another system that needed to be engineered correctly or it would fail. She read it standing in the middle of the unit with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the Carolina night pressing against the thin walls. Emma, if you're reading this, either I'm gone or something is coming that made you remember this place. Either way, the same thing applies. So here it is. You've spent years making yourself small. I know why. I understand the logic of it. I watched you build something real from the ground up in your own name, without any help from mine. And that took a kind of strength that has nothing to do with what I taught you on that ridge. I want you to know I understood it. I want you to know I was proud of it. But there's a difference between humility and concealment. Humility is refusing credit you don't need. Concealment is withholding capabilities someone else needs from you. The first is a virtue. The second is a choice. And when lives depend on what you can do, that choice has consequences. I'm not telling you to announce yourself. I'm not telling you to perform. I'm telling you that there will be a moment. You will know it when it arrives, because it will feel like every other moment in your life has been preparation for it. And in that moment, the only question will be whether you let what I taught you be used for what it was meant for, or whether you keep hiding it because you're afraid of what people will understand about you afterward. The rifles are serviced. You know the zeros. You know what to do. You were never standing in my shadow, Emma. You were always standing in your own light. Dad. She read it 3 times. Then she stood with it in her hand for a while, not moving, the paper pressed flat against her palm like she was checking it for temperature. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. She opened the rifle case. The .300 Win Mag was exactly as she remembered it. Her father's secondary, not his primary, the one he'd built specifically for her hands because at 14 she wasn't yet big enough for the full chassis, and he'd had a gunsmith modify the stock and trigger to fit. He'd maintained it after she'd stopped using it. Of course he had. He would have maintained it until there was no reason to. She checked the bore. Clean. She checked the action. Smooth. She pulled up the zero card from inside the case lid. 1,000 meters, standard atmospheric conditions, noted adjustments for altitude and temperature variance. She put the rifle down. She put the case in her vehicle. 2 days before Manifest, Dawson found her in the comms room at 2100. She was running final system checks, the kind you ran twice and then ran again because the cost of missing something in the field was not a paperwork problem. He knocked on the open door frame. She looked up. Got a minute? She looked back at the screen. Running checks. Yeah, I can see that. He came in anyway, stopped in the middle of the room like he was aware he hadn't been invited but was committed now. He had the look of someone who'd rehearsed an opening and then abandoned it. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Okay. The range scores, both of them. Is that... He paused, found a different angle. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Emma saved her diagnostic log and turned in her chair to face him. She looked at him for a moment the way she looked at equipment she was trying to understand the failure mode of. Montana, she said. Montana. He repeated it like the word didn't quite explain anything, which it didn't. Hunting? Among other things. A silence. He shifted his weight. You have family in the military. She held his gaze. Why? Because the way you shoot isn't... He stopped again. He was an expressive person, Dawson, but he'd hit the edge of something he didn't have language for yet. It's not a hunting thing. That's a trained thing. I've been around trained shooters my whole career, and that's not what hunting does to someone. Emma said nothing. Dawson waited. She turned back to her screens. I run the comms, she said. That's what I'm going to Fallujah to do. He stood there for another 3 seconds. She could feel him deciding whether to push it. He decided not to. Right, he said. Okay. He left. She listened to his footsteps move down the corridor and fade. Then she finished her system checks. The night before they flew out, her phone buzzed at 22:30 with an email from a JAG office in Arlington, Virginia. The sender was a name she didn't recognize attached to a law firm she'd never heard of. The subject line was 4 words, Estate of William Collins. Emma looked at the screen for a long time, the kind of looking that isn't reading, the kind that is just the mind running the same data through itself repeatedly, arriving at the same place, not knowing what to do with where it arrives. Her father was dead. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. The email was administrative and careful and gave her nothing beyond the 4 words in the subject line and a number to call during business hours. She set the phone down. She sat on the edge of her bunk. Around her, the barracks were quiet with the particular quality of quiet that exists before a deployment. Not peace, but the temporary suspension of everything that isn't immediate, a kind of enforced simplicity that the body sometimes mistakes for calm. She picked up the phone again. She put it in her pack. She set her alarm for 0400 and lay back and stared at the ceiling. She had a deployment to catch. She had a war to go to. She had, in the back of her vehicle, a rifle her father had maintained for her without being asked, and a letter he'd written to her for exactly this moment, and a set of zeros she hadn't forgotten in 15 years. And she had the particular weight that comes from finally understanding that the time for making yourself small is over. Not because someone told you to stop, and not because you decided to perform, but because something has shifted in the architecture of what matters, and you can feel it the way you feel weather changing, the way her father had taught her to feel everything, before it arrives, before anyone else knows it's coming. You know what to do. She closed her eyes. She did. 22 hours later, Staff Sergeant Emma Collins landed at Al-Taqadum Air Base, Iraq, with 43 Marines, 2 Sinskar suites, a satellite uplink package, and a rifle case in her personal gear that nobody had thought to ask about. In 6 days, they would be in Fallujah. In 8 days, everything would change. And Tyler Dawson, the man who'd looked at her like background furniture for 14 months, would watch her make the shot that no one in that city believed was possible, but not before it all went wrong in a way none of them saw coming. Al-Taqadum was not a place that eased you in gently. The C-130 dropped through the heat at a combat descent angle that made your stomach argue with your spine, and when the ramp opened, the air hit like something physical, dry and hot, and smelling of jet fuel and dust, and something else underneath that Emma couldn't name the first time she'd deployed to the region and had long since stopped trying. It was just the smell of this part of the world. You either got used to it or you didn't, and getting used to it didn't mean anything except that your nervous system had filed it away as background. She came down the ramp with her pack and her rifle case and her comms bag and found a patch of shade near the staging area and waited, the way you waited at every transit point in every deployment, with the particular patience of someone who understood that the military's relationship with time was adversarial and personal, and there was no point in taking it personally. Around her, the platoon reassembled itself from the scattered chaos of a combat landing. Gear was identified, manifested, moved. Names were called. The specific organized confusion of 43 people and their equipment arriving in a place where other people had already been operating and had developed systems and rhythms that the new arrivals didn't know yet. Gunnery Sergeant Kane moved through all of it with the efficiency of a man who had done this specific thing enough times that it had stopped requiring his full attention, which freed him to be watching everything simultaneously, which was the actual skill. He passed Emma twice without stopping. Dawson arrived at the staging area at the same time as Ortega, both of them with the slightly elevated energy that the first hours in country tended to produce. Not excitement exactly. More the physiological response to an environment that your nervous system correctly identified as higher stakes than the one you'd left. Heart rate up a few beats, sensory input sharper, the body doing what it was built to do. TQ looks the same as last time, Ortega said, scanning the base with the appraising look of a man doing inventory. Different vehicles at the flight line, Dawson said. Always different vehicles at the flight line. They were both right, Emma noted. She said nothing. She was watching the vehicle convoy forming up on the far side of the staging area. 4 MRAPs and a logistics truck, which meant they were moving ground to Camp Fallujah tonight rather than waiting for morning transport, which meant command wanted them in position faster than the original timeline had suggested, which meant something had either changed or was about to. She pulled out her green notebook and wrote, "Convoy tonight. Timeline compression. Verify frequency plan with CF comms on arrival." Kane appeared at her elbow. "Collins, you're in the 3rd vehicle. Comms package in the logistics truck. You're responsible for accountability on arrival." "Roger." "We're moving at 1,800, 90-minute drive, conditions permitting." He said conditions permitting the way everyone said it here, which was to say it while knowing that conditions were the one variable that never permitted anything in particular, and you were really just expressing hope dressed up as planning. "I'll have the frequency plan ready before we roll," Emma said. Kane looked at her for a second. Not the dismissive non-look she usually got, but something marginally more focused, and she had the sense that Briggs had said something to him about the qual scores, or the stress shoot results, or both. His expression didn't confirm this. His expression confirmed nothing. "Good," he said, and moved on. The drive from TQ to Camp Fallujah at night was the kind of experience that rearranged your relationship with darkness. The road was paved in sections and dirt in others, and the MRAPs moved through both with the lumbering, purposeful momentum of vehicles designed to absorb the worst of what roads in this country could offer, which was considerable. Emma rode in the 3rd vehicle between Ortega and a Marine she didn't know, named Specialist. No, Corporal, she corrected herself, wrong branch. Corporal Hansen, who had the build of a linebacker and the disposition of someone who dealt with anxiety by not moving unnecessarily. The convoy ran without lights, except for the infrared that the drivers used with NODs, which meant from the outside they were dark shapes moving through a dark landscape, and from the inside the world was the amber glow of the vehicle's interior instruments and the green-washed NOD feed on the driver's screen, and the particular combination of engine noise and road noise that varied constantly in ways that your nervous system learned to parse for changes that meant something. Emma kept her comms bag in her lap. She had the frequency plan memorized. She had it memorized before they'd left Lejeune, but she ran through it mentally anyway because that was the kind of person she was. The kind that reviewed systems not because she doubted them, but because reviewing them was part of maintaining them, and maintaining them was how they stayed reliable under conditions that tested reliability. Ortega fell asleep against the vehicle wall with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to sleep wherever the opportunity existed. Hansen stared at the NOD feed over the driver's shoulder. Emma watched the darkness outside the window and thought about her father, and then stopped thinking about her father because there was work to do, and work was the thing that held. They arrived at Camp Fallujah at 21:47. Camp Fallujah was larger and louder than TQ, and operated with the compressed, purposeful energy of a base that was inside the problem rather than adjacent to it. There were more vehicles, more weapons visible on more people. The radio traffic on the base net was heavier, shorter, more clipped, the communication pattern of people who were managing multiple simultaneous things and didn't have words to waste. Emma liked it, immediately and without sentimentality. She liked environments where every function was visible, where the purpose of each element was legible, where the noise had signal in it if you knew how to listen. She accounted for the comms package in 40 minutes, which was 12 minutes faster than the logistics timeline allowed for. She set up the primary SynGAR suite in the space the billeting NCO had allocated, ran an initial net sync, confirmed the satellite uplink was stable, and logged it all by 2340. Then she found her bunk, set her pack under it with the rifle case wedged against the wall at the back where it would be invisible unless someone was specifically looking, lay down in her uniform, and closed her eyes. She did not think about the JAG email. She was very deliberate about not thinking about it. She slept 4 hours. No. The operational brief happened at 700 in a plywood-walled room that smelled like sawdust and electronics, and the accumulated breath of too many people in too small a space. Emma sat in the third row with her green notebook open and a pen in her hand and her face doing the thing it did in briefings, which was nothing in particular, which had the secondary effect of making her look like she was processing less than she was. The officer leading the brief was a captain named Vasquez, attached from the special operations element, though he didn't specify which one, who had the economical physical presence of someone who'd been doing this long enough that every unnecessary motion had been edited out. He briefed from a map that had been hand-annotated in red and blue grease pencil, the kind of map that told you it had been updated recently and often. "The target is Hassan al-Badri," Vasquez said. He tapped a sector of the city marked in red, IED Network Facilitator. Specifically, he manages the supply chain for shaped charge components coming in from the north. We've been tracking him for 11 weeks. He's mobile, he changes locations every 48 to 72 hours, and he's got at least one 3-man close protection element with him at any time. He moved his hand to a cluster of buildings near a main road. Current intelligence puts him in this block as of 6 hours ago. That information has a shelf life. Someone in the front row asked about the close protection element's weapons profile. A KM's, at least one PKM that we've seen in imagery, and they're using civilian vehicles for movement, which means you don't have a clean vehicle profile to work from. Vasquez's voice didn't change in register. He was delivering information, not editorializing. ROE is standard LOAC. If he moves before we're in position, the mission adjusts. This isn't a capture or kill. Our preference is capture, full stop, because he has organizational knowledge that is currently worth more alive than dead. Questions on that? No questions on that. Vasquez moved to the communication plan. Emma's pen moved. Frequencies, call signs, the medevac request format specific to this area of operations, the quick reaction force standby posture. She wrote all of it in the shorthand she'd developed over 4 years that looked like noise to anyone else and was completely legible to her. Dawson was in the front row with a different kind of attention than the one he'd brought to the tactical piece of the brief. For the tactical material, he'd been alert, forward, interested. This was the kind of problem he oriented around naturally, the 3-dimensional chess of movement and cover and angles that a trained shooter understood in the body rather than just the head. But when Vasquez moved to the communication matrix, his attention had drifted slightly, the way people's attention drifted from the parts of a briefing that didn't apply to them. He didn't look back at Emma. He wouldn't have thought to. After the brief, Vasquez pulled Kane aside for a separate conversation that lasted 4 minutes. Emma observed this from the doorway while logging her notes. She couldn't hear the words. She could see Kane's face, and what she saw there was the expression of a man receiving information that required him to update his mental model of the mission's risk profile upward. That was useful data. She wrote, "Risk profile elevated." Vasquez briefed Kane separately, likely re-close protection element or additional intel on al-Badri's security posture. She underlined the word separately. The 4 days between arrival and the mission were the particular kind of waiting that the military manufactured in large quantities and for which there was no good solution except to fill the time with work. Emma filled it with work. She ran the morning comms checks, maintained the equipment, updated the frequency plan twice as the operational picture developed, and integrated with the Special Operations Elements Communications team. A sergeant named Del Vecchio, who was technically proficient, professionally correct, and who had the specific quality of attention toward Emma that told her Vasquez had said something to him about the comms package being important. He didn't say anything about her shooting scores. He didn't know about them. She was a comms specialist and she was doing comms work, and that was the full extent of what she was in this environment, which was exactly what she'd planned. She also ran. Every morning at 0530, before the heat built into the thing, it became by 900, she ran the perimeter road in the direction opposite the vehicle traffic, 3 miles at a pace that was slightly faster than comfortable, which she maintained by calibrating discomfort the way her father had taught her, not by pushing through it, but by redefining it, which was a different thing and took years to learn. On the third morning, Dawson was on the perimeter road too. He pulled alongside her at the half-mile mark, adjusted his pace to match hers, which required him to slow down slightly, which she noted he did without comment, and ran beside her for about 2 minutes without saying anything. Then, "You always run this early?" "Yes." "Huh." Another 30 seconds of footfalls. "You talked to Vasquez's comms guy?" "Del Vecchio." "Yes." "What's the net picture look like?" She glanced at him sideways. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm the designated shooter for this mission, and I'd like to know if we're going to have solid comms when it matters." It was a reasonable answer. It was also, she recognized, a different kind of question than the ones he'd been asking at Lejeune. Less ambient dominance, more operational. "Net is solid," she said. "Primary and backup. Medevac frequency is preloaded on the MBI-TR for every element. If primary goes down, we've got 30 seconds to alternate." He nodded. "Good." They ran another quarter mile. "Collins," he said. "What?" "What did you bring in the long case?" She didn't answer immediately. She let the question sit in the space between them for several strides, which itself was an answer of a kind, but not the one he was asking for. "Personal gear?" she said. He looked at her. She kept her eyes forward. "Right," he said. He accelerated and pulled ahead, and she let him go, and she finished her 3 miles at the same pace she'd started. And when she got back to the comms room, she ran her 0600 net check and logged it, and made coffee on the small burner Del Vecchio had set up on a plywood shelf, the kind of coffee that was strong enough to strip rust and was exactly what the situation called for. Mots. The mission briefing for execution was the night before. Vasquez ran it lean, 15 minutes, not 25, so because the operational picture had clarified and also because the intelligence had updated in a direction that tightened the timeline. "Al-Badri is moving tomorrow," Vasquez said. He put a satellite image on the board, annotated in the same red grease pencil. "We have a 4 to 6 hour window beginning at 0900 where he'll be in a fixed location at this compound," he pointed. "After that, unknown. We take the window." The plan was layered, an outer cordon of vehicles, an inner element on foot, 6 Marines plus 2 from the Special Operations package, moving through 2 alleys to a breach point on the south wall. Dawson positioned on a rooftop 3 buildings east with a laser designator and his M110 for overwatch. Emma with the inner element for communications. Not because Kane wanted her in the inner element, because the inner element needed continuous comms, and continuous comms required a person who could maintain continuous comms under whatever conditions the inner element encountered, and that person was Emma. She was going in. Dawson got his overwatch position, which was what he'd wanted, and Emma heard the satisfaction in his voice when he reviewed the plan with Ortega afterward. Not smug, just settled, the way a trained person feels when the role assigned matches the role prepared for. "Good angle from that rooftop," he said, spreading the imagery on the table. "I can see the south wall breach point and the main road approach. If there's a runner—" "You'll have him," Ortega said. "I'll have him." Emma was on the other side of the room, updating the comms card for each member of the inner element, writing call signs and frequencies in the precise small print she used for field documentation. She wasn't listening to Dawson's conversation in any way that was obvious. She was absorbing it the way she absorbed most things in operational environments, peripherally, automatically, filed without commentary. She wrote her own call sign last. Echo 6, comms, inner element. She did not write, rifle case and personal gear, still unannounced, reason unclear even to me. That would have been too honest, even for a private notebook. The night before the mission, she sat on her bunk for a while doing nothing, which was unusual for her and which she recognized as unusual, which told her something about her state that she didn't particularly want to examine too carefully. Her father was dead. She had not called the JAG office. She had been telling herself she was waiting for a better moment, a quieter moment, a moment when she had the bandwidth. This was true, and it was also not the full truth. The full truth was that calling the JAG office would make it real in a different way than the email had made it real, and she was not ready for that particular reality to land its full weight on her yet. She opened her father's letter. She'd folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, which meant she'd been carrying it for 5 days without making a decision about it. She read it again. Not the whole thing, just the last 3 lines. You were never standing in my shadow. You were always standing in your own light. She folded it back, put it in her pocket. She thought about the rifle case under her bunk. She thought about tomorrow's mission and the 4 to 6 hour window and the close protection element with the PKM and the alley approach that would have limited sight lines and what it would mean to have the inner element engaged in a close environment without effective overwatch suppression if something went sideways. She thought about Dawson on his rooftop with his M11, which was a good weapon, and he was a capable shooter, and under normal conditions that was enough. She thought about the word normal and what it usually meant in a sentence that included conditions. Then she stopped thinking and checked her gear for the 3rd time that evening and set her alarm for 04:30 and lay down. At 04:45, before the alarm, she was already awake. She lay in the dark listening to the base's ambient sound, vehicles, distant radio traffic, the wind moving through the structural gaps in the prefab buildings with a low register sound like breath. She thought about her father teaching her to read wind at 9 years old. Standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, not guiding her aim, just resting there, present, the way he was always present in those early mornings on the Montana field, completely without distraction, his attention on her and the task as though there was nothing else in the world that existed or required him. She missed him with a sudden completeness that arrived without warning and hit harder than she'd expected because she'd been managing it for 6 days by not thinking about it, and the management had just failed. She lay still until it passed. It took a few minutes. Then she got up. She went to the comms room and ran a pre-mission net check at 0500, 90 minutes before the scheduled check, because the equipment didn't care what time it was, and neither did she, and there was nothing else useful to do with her hands at 0500 on the morning of a mission. Del Vecchio came in at 0515, saw her at the bench, and said nothing. He poured himself coffee and sat at the other bench and ran his own checks, and they worked in the same room without speaking for 40 minutes, which was the most companionable interaction she'd had with anyone at this base. At 0600, Kane appeared in the doorway with his kit already on and the expression of a man who had resolved all his doubts about the day and was now purely operational. "Collins, you're up." "Net is green," she said. "All elements checked in. Medevac is briefed and standing by." But Kane looked at the board, back at her. Something moved across his face, brief, almost involuntary, that might have been the beginning of something like reassessment. It didn't last long enough to identify clearly. "Good," he said. "Get your kit. We move in 90. She was already reaching for it. The inner element staged at the south vehicle gate at 0730. 6 Marines, Kane, Ortega, Dawson's teammate Hansen, 2 riflemen named Kowalski and Perez, and Emma, plus 2 figures from the Special Operations Package who gave call signs and no names and whose gear was marked with no unit identifiers, which was common enough in this environment that it had stopped being remarkable. Dawson was separate, moving with a single partner to the rooftop position. He passed the inner element staging area on his way to the vehicle and stopped for a moment. He looked at Emma's kit, at the MBITR on her left shoulder, at the M16 slung across her chest, at the comms bag on her back that added 12 pounds to her load and didn't make her look combat heavy the way the rifleman did, but that she wore without any visible adjustment in posture or carriage. He looked at the gear, then at her. "Good comms," he said. "That's what we need." "That's what you'll have," Emma said. He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded once and moved on. Ortega beside Emma watched this exchange with the quiet attention he brought to most things. "He's nervous," Ortega said, low enough that it was just for her. "Good," Emma said. "Nervous is appropriate." Ortega almost smiled. "Yeah." The vehicles staged. The brief crackled over the net. Emma ran a final radio check across all elements. Inner, outer cordon, overwatch, the QRF element staged 2 clicks back and received acknowledgement from each. Everything was green. Everything was ready. The city waited beyond the gate in the morning heat that was already building toward the thing it would become by noon, the sun low and sharp and throwing long shadows from the buildings along the main route. The shadows that would shift and shrink as the morning went on and the window Vasquez had identified either held or didn't. Kane looked at his watch. "Move out," he said. Emma checked the rifle slung across her chest, checked the MBITR, checked the comms bag. She thought of her father's letter in her jacket pocket. There will be a moment. The gate opened. They went in. The alley was narrow enough that 2 people couldn't walk it side by side without their shoulders touching the walls, which were the color of dried clay and pocked with old damage that told a story about previous arguments in this neighborhood that hadn't been settled with words. Emma moved third in the stack, behind Kane and Ortega, with Hansen behind her and Kowalski and Perez at the rear. The 2 Special Operations Marines had split off at the last intersection to take a parallel route that would bring them to the breach point from a different angle, which was the kind of tactical geometry that looked clean on a map and required precise timing to execute without someone ending up in someone else's line of fire. The radio on her shoulder was silent. Good silence. The kind that meant all elements were moving and nobody had anything urgent to say yet. She monitored it with the automatic attention of someone whose nervous system had been trained to flag changes in background noise, which was the only kind of attention a radio really required when things were going correctly. She was also watching the walls. The windows above them, 3 floors of residential and commercial construction packed together in the way that cities in this region grew, organically, without the grid logic of American urban planning, each building a slightly different height and footprint from its neighbor, so that the roofline was irregular and offered a dozen angles that weren't visible from the ground until you were directly under them. Her father had taught her to read architecture. Not formally. There had been no course, no manual. But on the ridge in Montana, he'd talked about line of sight the way other fathers talked about baseball, as a constant ambient topic, and she'd absorbed it the same way, without realizing it was happening until it was already done. She was reading 3 windows on the left side of the alley as they moved, tracking the light patterns inside each one, the specific quality of stillness that an empty room produced versus the different quality of stillness that a room with a person in it produced. The second window was bothering her, not because she'd seen movement, because the curtain had been disturbed from the inside. The bottom edge had a fold in it that didn't match the top edge's drape, which meant someone had held it aside recently to look out and then let it fall without straightening it. She keyed her radio once, a single click. The signal for hold. Kane's fist went up immediately. The stack stopped. He looked back at her, a question on his face that was really just a raised eyebrow. Emma pointed with 2 fingers at the second window on the left. Then she held up her hand flat. Wait. And watched. 12 seconds. The curtain moved, just slightly. The kind of movement that an air current in an open building produced, which was how you'd explain it away if you were looking for reasons to keep moving. But the air in the alley was not moving. It was morning, and the buildings on either side created a thermal pocket that was still and hot and would stay that way until the afternoon wind came through. Kane saw it. He pulled the stack back 10 feet to the intersection and crouched against the wall. He looked at Emma. "Your call," he said, low and flat, not deferring, asking for the specific kind of information she'd demonstrated she had, which was spatial awareness. He was being tactical, not generous. "Someone's been watching from that window," Emma said. "Not necessarily hostile, could be a resident." She paused. "But they were looking down the alley in our direction of movement, not up it." Kane processed this. Alternate route adds 3 minutes. Alternate route doesn't pass under that window. He looked at her for 1 more second. Then he made the decision the way good NCOs made decisions. Fast, without theater, with a clear understanding that he was the one who owned it, regardless of whose information it came from. "Alternate route," he said. He keyed his radio and gave the brief route change to the special operations element and to Dawson's overwatch position. Dawson acknowledged with 2 clicks. They moved. The alternate route took 3 minutes and 20 seconds, which was 20 seconds more than Kane had said, because the second alley had a vehicle parked across it that required them to move single file through a gap between the vehicle's bumper and the wall that was tighter than any of them liked, and made noise on Hansen's kit that everyone heard and nobody mentioned. They came out on the south wall of the target compound at 09:08. The breach point was a wooden door, sun-bleached and dried to the consistency of something that had given up on being wood years ago and was now just maintaining the shape out of habit. One of the Special Operations Marines was already there, crouched at the hinge side, with a compact tool package that he ran without ceremony or wasted motion. The door opened in 45 seconds. They went in. The compound was a 2-story building arranged around a central courtyard that the satellite imagery had shown, but that imagery never fully conveyed because imagery was flat, and courtyards had depth and dimension, and the relationship between the buildings around it that you only understood when you were standing in it. The courtyard was about 15 meters across, dirt floor, a water tank on the east wall, 2 vehicles under a canvas awning on the north side, a white pickup and a sedan with no rear bumper. 2 vehicles. The intelligence had said 1. Kane registered this with a flat look that contained everything he thought about intelligence estimates without expressing any of it vocally. He gestured, Ortega and Kowalski to the stairwell on the left, Special Operations Marines to the right building, Hansen and Perez on the vehicles, Emma with Kane, central courtyard, communication. It went fast and quiet, the way rehearsed things went when the environment cooperated, and for about 90 seconds the environment cooperated. Then the radio exploded. Not Emma's radio, Dawson's transmission, coming through on the Overwatch net with a controlled urgency that was worse than panic because it meant he was holding himself together. And the thing he was telling her still sounded like this. Inner, Overwatch. 2 military-age males on the roof of the building immediately north of your position, armed. They have eyes on the courtyard. They're not moving yet, but they know something's in there. How copy? Kane keyed his radio. Copy. Overwatch. Do they have eyes on personnel? A half-second pause. Negative. Not yet. They're reacting to the vehicle noise. 2 minutes, maybe less. Kane looked around the courtyard. At the vehicles. At the stairwell where Ortega and Kowalski had just disappeared. At the canvas awning that provided 0 overhead cover. Options, he said, not to anyone in particular. Awning's canvas, Emma said. No overhead concealment. We need to be inside or behind the vehicles. If they have a PKM on that roof and they open up on the courtyard. The vehicles won't stop it, Emma said. The engine block might. She was already moving toward the white pickup, keeping low, using the angle of the sedan's body to mask her movement from the north wall. Kane came with her without being asked, which she registered as the specific kind of trust that gets extended in operational environments when someone has demonstrated they're reading the situation correctly. They got behind the engine block of the pickup. 10 seconds later, the first shot came from the north building, not from the roof. From a second-floor window, which meant there was a third armed element that Dawson hadn't seen yet, because the window faced a different direction from the roof access point, which meant the intelligence on the close protection element had been wrong by at least 1. The round hit the canvas awning and went through it and hit the dirt floor of the courtyard and threw up a small geyser of dry earth that immediately became a brownish haze in the still air. Contact, Kane transmitted. North building, second floor, single shooter, inner element is... The second shot came before he finished the sentence, and this one hit the sedan's rear quarter panel with a sound like someone hitting a metal drum with a hammer, loud and immediate, and without any of the cinematic grace that made gunfire seem navigable from a distance. From the stairwell, Ortega's voice, tight and fast. Gunny, we have a problem. Second floor is cleared, but there are people up here. Civilians, I think, 2 adults and children. They're in the back room. Hold position, Kane snapped back. Do not move them until the courtyard is clear. Emma was already on the command net, transmitting in the controlled flat voice that was the product of 4 years of practice, maintaining communication while other things were happening around it. Falcon Base, Echo 6, inner element in contact, target compound, grid follows. She read the grid from the card on her wrist, precise. No hesitation. 3+ armed personnel requesting QRF standby. Acknowledge. The response came back in under 10 seconds. QRF acknowledged. Standing by. She transmitted to Dawson. Overwatch, inner. Second floor window, north building, active shooter. Can you acquire? Dawson's voice came back with a new quality in it, focused and frustrated in equal measure. Negative. Window is on the north face. I don't have the angle from this position. I'm blind to that wall. Emma processed this. Looked at the north building, looked at the angle of the compound wall, looked at the gap between the pickup's hood and the compound's south wall, and the line of sight that gap created toward the upper portion of the north building's east face. What about the roof element? She transmitted. Still up there. They haven't engaged yet. They're trying to figure out where you are. If they move to the east side of that roof, then I have them, Dawson said. But I need them to move. Right now they're behind the parapet on the north face, and I've got nothing. A third shot from the second floor window. This one went over the pickup's cab and hit the compound's south wall 8 feet above Kane's head and sent concrete chips down into the space they were occupying. Kane pulled back further behind the engine block with a controlled economy of motion and an expression that had resolved into something very simple and very focused. We can't stay here, he said. No, Emma agreed. Perez's voice came over the internal net. Gunny, vehicle 2. I can get to the corner of the east building. Get an angle on that window. Negative, Kane said. That crossing is open. You'll be in the open for 6 meters. I can make it. You will not make that crossing, Kane said, and the flatness in his voice was not anger. It was the specific kind of certainty that closed the conversation permanently. Perez went quiet. Hansen, from the other side of the sedan. QRFETA? Emma checked her watch. She'd requested standby, not launch. 7 minutes if I launch them now. Longer if the north building has eyes on the entry route. Launch them, Kane said. She transmitted the launch order, confirmed receipt. 7 minutes became the operational time frame, which meant 7 minutes of holding the current position while the second-floor shooter worked through the geometry of the courtyard and the roof element above tried to figure out where the inner element had gone. 7 minutes was a long time in a space this size with this many moving parts. She knew it. Kane knew it. Neither of them said it because saying it didn't change the math. The next 3 minutes established a rhythm that was not sustainable but had to be sustained. The second-floor shooter fired every 40 to 60 seconds. Not suppressive fire, which would have been continuous, but deliberate shots, which meant he was aiming rather than area shooting, which meant he thought he had a bead on someone's position and was working to confirm it. He didn't have Emma and Kane's position. He had the area of the sedan. He was working the sedan systematically, walking rounds along it from rear to front, which meant eventually he was going to work his way to the gap where Kane and Emma were behind the pickup's engine block. Emma was watching the north building's upper floor and running the geometry. There was a window on the east face of the north building, not the one the shooter was using, a different one floor up. It was shuttered, but the shutter had a gap at the bottom where the wood had warped or been left ajar, and the gap was large enough that if she could get eyes on it from the right angle, she could determine whether there was a second shooting position being set up there. She couldn't get eyes on it from here. The angle was wrong. She'd need to be 8 feet further east, which meant leaving the cover of the engine block, which meant 6 feet of open courtyard before she reached the corner of the canvas awning support post, which was not cover, but was concealment, and concealment was something. She looked at the 6 feet, calculated the shooter's timing. He was averaging 50 seconds between shots. The last shot had come 40 seconds ago. She waited 10 more seconds. I need to move, she told Kane. He looked at her. Where? She pointed at the awning post. He looked at it, looked at the distance, looked at her. That's open ground. 8 feet. In his sight line. He's on the west face of the sedan. I'll come out on the east. Kane did the math. The math worked, barely. The second you're exposed, I'll be at the post before his next shot cycle. He held her gaze for a moment. Go. She went. 8 feet, low and fast, the kind of movement that was not graceful and was not supposed to be graceful. It was supposed to be fast. and she was fast in the specific way of someone who had been trained to move under pressure rather than someone who had simply decided to be brave about it, which was a different thing entirely. She hit the post at the 3-second mark and pressed against it, and nothing came from the north building for another 12 seconds, which meant she'd made the move correctly between shot cycles. From this angle, she could see the shuttered window, the gap at the bottom, the shadow behind the gap that was moving in the way that shadows moved when they were attached to something with intent. "Kane," she transmitted quietly. "East face, upper floor, second position. He's setting up. Copy. A beat. Overwatch, inner, second shooting position, north building, east face, upper window. Can you acquire?" Dawson's response was immediate and taut. "Negative. East face is behind my angle. I need... Wait." A pause. 3 seconds. 5. "The roof element just moved. They're crossing to the east parapet. I have them." The implication was immediate, and Kane was already processing it. The roof element moving to the east side meant they'd identified roughly where the inner element was, and they were repositioning to get an angle down into the courtyard. If Dawson engaged the roof element now, he'd prevent the flanking fire from above, but he'd also announce the overwatch position, which might push the second-floor shooter to relocate to the east window, which would open up an angle on Ortega's position in the stairwell. If Dawson didn't engage, the roof element would have a clear angle on the courtyard in approximately 30 seconds. "Overwatch inner," Emma transmitted. "Engage the roof element. Now." A half second. "Collins, that's not your call," Kane said. "Gunny, the east window is 30 seconds from operational. If we lose the courtyard to 2 simultaneous positions..." "Overwatch, stand by," Kane transmitted. He looked at Emma. "If he engages, he gives up his position. If he doesn't engage, we're in a crossfire." The math was the same for both of them. It was bad math all the way around, and there was no version of it that was clean, which was the actual truth of how operational decisions got made, and Emma could see on Kane's face that he knew it and was accepting it, and she watched him make the call. "Overwatch, inner, engage." Dawson's M110 fired twice. The roof went quiet, but the east window opened. The second shooter didn't fire immediately. He was establishing his position, which meant they had maybe 15 seconds before he found the angle. And in those 15 seconds, Emma was running the new geometry from her position at the awning post, and she saw it. From the east window's position, the shooter would have a direct line on the stairwell door, which was where Ortega and Kowalski were, which was where Ortega had just transmitted that there were civilians, which was where all of that converged into something she was not willing to accept. She keyed her radio. "Ortega, get everyone flat on the floor, east side of the room, now." "What?" "Do it now, Ortega." A pause, then, "Copy, moving." Emma turned to Kane. "I need the rifle case." He looked at her. "Gunny." Her voice was level, not pleading, stating. "The east window has a line on the stairwell. The second-floor shooter is still active on the west. Dawson is blown. They know where he is now, and they'll pin him in the next 2 minutes. We have..." She checked her watch. 4 minutes before QRF arrives. In those 4 minutes, we have 2 active shooters in that building and no angle on either." "You have a rifle in that case," Kane said. Not a question. "Yes." "What kind?" 300 Winchester Magnum. Something crossed his face that was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of a man who had been operating on one model of a situation and has just had the model updated in a way that changes everything. "From where?" he said. She looked at the compound's south wall. At the gap above the water tank that the satellite imagery had shown was a rooftop access point for the adjacent building, at the angle from that rooftop to the north building's east face. "The adjacent roof," she said. "I can see both windows from there." "That's 300 meters to the east window." "Yes." He stared at her, the stare that was the last moment before a decision that couldn't be unmade. "Can you make that shot?" Emma held his gaze without flinching and without performing. "Yes." The second shooter in the east window opened up. The rounds hit the stairwell door frame and threw splinters into the courtyard, and Ortega's voice came over the radio with something in it that was as close to panic as Emma had ever heard from him. We've got a hit. Kowalski is down. It's his left arm. He's not critical, but he's bleeding. Kane was already moving. Perez Hansen. Suppress the east window. Full rate of fire. I don't care if you hit it. I want his head down. He grabbed Emma's arm. Not rough, but definite. Where's the case? Logistics truck. My personal gear. Bottom compartment. He turned to the Special Operations Marine who had appeared at his elbow from somewhere in the last 45 seconds, like a very competent ghost. Get it. Now. The man went. Kane looked at Emma. You have 3 minutes. I need 2. He almost said something. She could see it. The sentence that would have been about her job description, or her lane, or any of the 20 other ways in which this moment was outside the parameters of what he had known her to be. He didn't say it. He let it go with the specific pragmatism of an NCO who had been in enough bad situations to know that the moment you're in is the only moment that exists. Then move, he said. She moved. What? The rifle case arrived at the base of the south wall 30 seconds later, carried by the Special Operations Marine at a controlled run that covered the courtyard's open section, while Perez and Hansen kept the east window occupied with a volume of fire that wasn't particularly accurate but was absolutely sufficient to make the second shooter's world very small and very loud. Emma had the combination open before the case was fully on the ground. The .300 Win Mag was there, exactly as it had been when she'd checked it in the storage unit. Her father's work? Careful, thorough, the work of someone who understood that the difference between a rifle that functioned and one that didn't could come down to the quality of attention given to it when there was no particular urgency to give it. She pulled the weapon, checked the action by feel, bolt, carrier, the specific texture of a clean mechanism moving as it should. She'd loaded the magazine in her vehicle at TQ the morning they'd arrived, which meant it had been in the case for 4 days, which was fine. She went up the wall access. The adjacent rooftop was flat and approximately 12 meters by 8, with a low parapet on 3 sides and the north face open to the alley below. It smelled like hot tar and brick dust, and the faint mineral smell of air that had been very hot for a very long time. She moved to the north parapet and got down behind it and set up in the prone with the natural body position that she hadn't consciously assumed in years, but that was so built into her physical architecture that it arrived without deliberation, cheek to stock, support, arm angled correctly, the weapon's weight distributed through her skeleton rather than her muscles because her father had taught her that muscles fatigue and bone structure doesn't. She found the east window through the scope, 320 meters. The scope was zeroed for 1,000. She adjusted the turret. She'd memorized the adjustment chart for this weapon at every common engagement distance before she was 18, and the data was simply there, available, the way a language you learned young is available, without translation. The east window came clear in the glass. She could see movement. The shooter was using the window frame as a rest, which told her his position, which meant she knew exactly where to put the round. She also needed to manage 2 things simultaneously: the east window shooter and the second floor west shooter who was still working the courtyard. She couldn't engage both in the same position. The angles were different. She'd need to move between shots, which created exposure, which was a real problem, and not one she was pretending wasn't there. She heard her father's voice, not as memory, but as something more immediate, the internal voice of every lesson absorbed so deeply it had stopped being instruction and become instinct. You don't get to choose your conditions. You only get to choose what you do in them. She exhaled. Let the crosshairs settle. In the east window, the shooter shifted position slightly, trying to find a new angle on the stairwell door. He was reorganizing. He'd be still in approximately 2 seconds. She counted. 1. The shooter settled. The rifle fired. The sound of a .300 Win Mag in an urban environment is a physical event. It is not the crack of an M16. It is something broader, something that pushes on your sternum from the inside. And on an open rooftop with nothing to absorb it, it hit everything around Emma simultaneously and was gone before any of it could matter. The east window went still. Emma was already rolling left, changing position by 4 meters, resetting the prone, finding the west-face second-floor window through the scope, and adjusting for the new distance. 305 meters to the west face, slightly different angle. Compensate left 2 clicks. Wind coming from the northwest again. Same 6-knot push she'd cataloged on the way in. The second-floor shooter was moving. He'd heard the shot from the adjacent roof and was relocating, which was the correct tactical response, and also meant he was moving across the room toward the door, and for approximately 3 seconds he would cross the window. She waited. He crossed. She fired. The second shot was not as clean as the first. She knew it immediately. She'd broken it a half count early, the wind had pushed it slightly right, and she saw through the scope that it had not been a definitive hit. The shooter was down behind the window frame and not firing, but she didn't know if that was because she'd hit him or because he'd correctly identified the threat and gone to ground. She held the position, watching. The scope magnified the window into a gray frame of concrete and shadow and nothing moving. 10 seconds, 15. No fire from the west window. Over her radio, Perez. West face is quiet. Kane. Copy. Hold. From the stairwell. Ortega's voice lower now, the urgency dialed back 1 notch. Kowalski is stable, applying pressure. He's not going anywhere, but he's talking. Emma remained behind the parapet with the rifle up and the scope on the west window. The scope was not showing her anything that resolved the uncertainty cleanly. The shooter might be hit, might be waiting, might be moving to a third position she hadn't identified. She stayed in the scope and kept watching and did not move and did not assume. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it, the rhythm in her throat that arrived under adrenaline and couldn't be eliminated, only managed. And she managed it the way she'd been taught, not by fighting it, but by letting it exist and continuing to function around it, the way you functioned around any condition that couldn't be changed. The west window stayed quiet. The east window stayed quiet. From somewhere beyond the compound wall, in the direction of the main road, she could hear the distinctive sound of MRAP engines, the QRF, arriving on schedule, which meant the external geometry was about to change, and the pressure on the north building would multiply. She kept the scope where it was, and waited and breathed and did not move. Below her in the courtyard, Kane was running the reset, consolidating the inner element, getting accountability, preparing to receive QRF, and push on the objective, which was still al-Badri, who was somewhere in this compound or wasn't, and whose presence or absence would determine what happened next in a way that the last 8 minutes of controlled chaos had not resolved. Emma heard Kane's voice, crisp and operational, running the net. She heard Ortega give Kowalski's condition again. Stable, ambulatory, with assistance, arms secured. She heard Dawson acknowledge on the Overwatch net, his position now known, requesting guidance on whether to move or stay. She heard all of it and maintained her position and kept the scope on the window that was still not showing her what she needed to see. And she stayed in the place she'd been trained to stay. In the present moment, in the data, in the discipline of waiting for the picture to clarify rather than deciding it had. The west window stayed quiet. And then from somewhere inside the north building, from a direction she couldn't precisely locate from her position, she heard a door. She heard it close. And she heard feet on stairs moving down, moving fast, moving in the direction of the compound's north exit. The exit that the satellite imagery had shown, but that the mission plan had designated as a secondary containment point rather than a primary, which meant it was covered, but not heavily covered. She keyed her radio. Kane? Her voice was flat and quick. North exit. Someone's moving. A beat. 1 second. Kane's voice. Copy. Overwatch. North exit. Possible runner. Do you have eyes? Dawson's response came back with a new tension in it that was different from everything that had come before. I have eyes, he said. And then, after a half second that lasted longer than half a second, Gunny. The man coming out that door is not one of the shooters. The radio held the silence for a moment that nobody filled. Copy. Overwatch, Kane said carefully. Describe. 50s, civilian clothing. He's got a bag. He's moving fast. Another beat. He matches the imagery. Nobody said anything. Dawson said it. I think it's him. Emma was already reading the angle from her position. The north exit was approximately 410 meters from the adjacent rooftop. The lane was partially obscured by the compound wall's extension. She had a window of maybe 8 meters through which she could see the exit before the building to the north cut the line of sight completely. 8 meters at a moving target's pace was approximately 4 seconds of exposure. She did not transmit. She moved the scope to the north exit. She found the door. She waited. The door opened. A man came through it at the kind of pace that was not running, but was everything short of running, the pace of someone who understood urgency and was applying it without losing control. He had a bag across one shoulder, and he was moving north, and he had approximately 3 seconds before the building on the far side of the alley cut him from view completely, and then he was in the street, and then he was gone. Emma's breathing had already found its cycle. The crosshairs settled. She did not think about the letter in her pocket. She did not think about her father. She did not think about Kowalski's arm, or the east window, or the 2 shots she'd already fired, or the question of what everyone around her was about to understand about her. She thought about the wind. 6 knots from the northwest. The thermal from the alley floor was pulling up slightly. Distance was 415, adjusted. The man was moving at approximately 4 miles per hour, angle of movement roughly perpendicular to her line of fire. She applied the lead. She fired. The man sat down in the alley like his legs had simply stopped receiving instructions and then lay back and did not move. The bag came to rest beside him. The alley was empty. Emma held the position, watching through the scope, not moving. The rooftop was very quiet, and the city around it was doing the things cities did after concentrated violence, a strange, held-breath quality, like the place itself was reassessing. Over the radio, nobody said anything for 3 full seconds. Then Dawson's voice, very quiet. Target is down. Kane, copy. A pause. Dawson again, and this time there was something in his voice that Emma had not heard from him before. Not in 14 months at Lejeune, not on the flight out, not in 4 days at Camp Fallujah, not in the last 8 minutes of a firefight that had tested every assumption every person on this mission had brought into the city with them. Gunny, Dawson said. That shot was 400 meters, from a cold position, after 2 prior engagements. Kane did not respond immediately. Emma lowered the rifle from her shoulder. She checked the action. She kept her eyes on the alley. Who made that shot? Dawson said, and the question was not rhetorical. He genuinely wanted the answer confirmed out loud. Kane's voice came back level and without inflection. Echo 6B made that shot. On the rooftop, Emma heard this transmission the way you hear something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt the thing she always felt after a shot that mattered. A kind of hollow, clean quiet, the absence of everything that had been present before it, the way the air feels after a storm has moved through and taken the pressure with it. She broke down the firing position, checked the scope caps, rose from the prone. Below her, the inner element was consolidating. The QRF was through the gate. The north building was now surrounded. Somewhere in the alley to the north, a man who had been responsible for dozens of deaths was lying in the dirt with a bag beside him. And in the compound, she could already hear Kane on the radio managing the operational aftermath. Accountability, medevac for Kowalski, evidence collection, the machinery of a mission that had just moved from execution to exploitation. She picked up the rifle case. She went back down the wall. When she came through the courtyard, Kane was there. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He did not say anything for a moment, and the moment had a weight to it that she recognized as the weight of a man recalibrating something fundamental. "You need to talk to me," he said finally. "When this is done, you and me." "Roger that, Gunny," Emma said. She walked past him toward the stairwell to check on Kowalski. Behind her, she heard Dawson's voice on the radio, still in the overwatch position, giving his post-engagement report in the measured cadence of a professional doing professional work. But the report kept stopping and restarting, like a man trying to describe something he doesn't quite have the language for yet. Like a man reassembling his understanding of the world he thought he was operating in. Emma reached the stairwell and went up. She had work to do. Kowalski was sitting against the stairwell wall with his back straight and his left arm wrapped in a pressure dressing that Ortega had applied with the competent speed of someone who'd done it before. The dressing was good, tight, properly positioned, the kind that held without cutting circulation. Kowalski's face was the color of old concrete, and he was breathing through his nose in a controlled way that meant he was managing pain rather than being managed by it. He looked up when Emma came in. "Staff Sergeant? How's the arm?" "Attached," he said, "which is the main thing." She crouched beside him and checked the dressing without asking permission, running 2 fingers along the edge to verify the pressure was distributed correctly, checking the color of his fingertips. Good enough. Not perfect, but good enough, which was the operational standard for everything in rooms like this one. "QRF medic will be up in 2 minutes, she said. "I know." He paused. "I heard the shots. From up here." He looked at her. "Were those yours?" She looked at the dressing. "How's your pain level?" Kowalski held her gaze for a second, reading whatever was or wasn't on her face, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He nodded once, slowly, as if she'd answered a different question than the one she'd deflected. 7, he said. "Pain level. Good. 7 means you're still thinking." She stood, checked the room, 2 adults and 1 child in the back corner, the civilians Ortega had secured, sitting with the particular stillness of people who had learned that stillness was the correct response to armed strangers in their building. The adults were watching Emma with flat, careful eyes. The child was watching the window. Ortega was at the room's door, rifle up, watching the stairwell below. "Clear?" Emma asked. "Basement hasn't been cleared yet. Waiting on QRF." "Copy." She went back to the window and looked down into the courtyard. Kane was below, moving between the QRF Marines and his own element with the purposeful efficiency of a man running controlled chaos. The Special Operations package was already at the north exit. She could see them through the gap in the south wall, working the alley where the target had gone down, which was either evidence collection or confirmation of the hit, probably both. She looked at the alley. She looked at the bag lying in the dirt beside the man who wasn't moving. She looked away. The debrief happened at Camp Fallujah at 1600, in the same plywood room that had smelled like sawdust and electronics at 700, and now smelled like those things, plus the particular worn-out quality of people who had been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and were now coming down from it, whether they wanted to or not. Vasquez ran it. Kane sat at the table. The 2 Special Operations Marines were present, but positioned at the edges of the room in the way that people in their line of work positioned themselves. Present without being central, observing without announcing the observation. Dawson sat across from Emma. He'd been looking at her since the vehicles had loaded, not the dismissive ambient awareness he'd given her for 14 months. Something different. The sustained attention of a man trying to reconcile 2 incompatible versions of something he thought he understood. She let him look. She had a green notebook open in front of her, and she was finishing her comms log from the mission. Every transmission, every acknowledgement, every timestamp, because the log needed to be complete before the debrief concluded, and completing it was work she could do with her hands that gave her somewhere to be other than inside whatever was about to happen in this room. Vasquez started at the beginning and worked forward. Movement to objective, initial contact, the route change. "The route change," Vasquez said, and stopped. He looked at Kane. "That was a judgment call at the element leader level. Walk me through the decision." Kane's voice was flat and factual. Collins identified a surveillance indicator at the second window on the primary route. Her read was that we were being watched from a position that suggested the watcher knew our direction of movement. The alternate route added 3 minutes and avoided a potential compromise. Vasquez wrote something. Collins. He looked at her without inflection. "What was the indicator?" She looked up from the log. Curtain disturbance consistent with recent deliberate movement rather than air current. Bottom edge fold didn't match the top drape. Thermal conditions in the alley ruled out passive air movement as the cause. Vasquez held her gaze for a moment. "You rid curtain physics while moving under kit through a hostile alley. It's pattern recognition," she said. "You stop noticing you're doing it." He wrote something else. She couldn't see what. He moved forward through the timeline. The courtyard. The initial contact from the second-floor west window, the east window position being established. Kowalski's wound. Then he reached the part that had brought a different quality of attention into the room. He stopped writing. He looked at her directly, and the look was not accusatory, but it was thorough in the way that a good officer's look was thorough, taking in information without revealing what he was doing with it yet. "Walk me through the decision to retrieve the personal rifle," he said. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people being discreet, the quiet of people listening. Emma set down her pen. The tactical situation at that point had 2 active shooters in the north building. The east window position had a direct line on the stairwell with civilian personnel and a wounded Marine. The overwatch position was blown, and Dawson was effectively pinned by the newly identified threat. The QRF was 4 minutes out. We needed suppression on both windows simultaneously or sequential engagement before the east window consolidated its position. "And you assessed that you could do that?" "I assessed that I was the option available." Vasquez looked at Kane. "Gunny." Kane's hands were flat on the table. She was right about the tactical picture. The east window would have had a clear line on the stairwell within 30 seconds of the time she requested the rifle. "I made the call to authorize retrieval." "You knew she had the rifle." "I knew she had a case. She told me what was in it when the situation required a decision." Vasquez absorbed this. He wrote something. He put his pen down. "Staff Sergeant Collins," he said, "you fired 3 shots this morning, 2 from the adjacent rooftop, clearing both active shooter positions. 1 at the north exit." A pause. "The north exit shot was approximately 415 meters, moving target, oblique angle, cold position, 3rd engagement of the morning." He stopped again. "Where does a communication specialist learn to make that shot?" The room had the quality of held breath. Emma looked at Vasquez and then at Kane, and then at the table, not evasively, just taking a moment to decide how to answer something she had been not answering for 4 years and was now going to have to answer. "My father," she said. "Who is your father?" She looked at him. "William Collins." The 2 Special Operations Marines at the edge of the room. One of them moved, a small, involuntary shift of weight, the physical equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The other one went very still in the way that people went still when a piece of information arrived that reorganized other pieces of information they'd been holding. Vasquez looked at Emma without changing his expression. "Ghost Collins." That's what people called him. Past tense. She held his gaze. "Yes." A pause. "I'm sorry," Vasquez said, and meant it in the clean, direct way of someone who knew what that loss meant in terms that were not abstract. She nodded once. He picked up his pen, put it down again. "You've been in the Corps 4 years." "Yes." "Comms throughout." "Yes." "And you've been shooting like this the whole time." It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. "I've been maintaining proficiency. I qualled above standard every year." Kane made a sound. Not quite a laugh. More the sound a man made when a sequence of events he'd been present for suddenly reorganized themselves into a pattern he should have read earlier and hadn't. 243, he said. "At Lejeune," Emma said. "Yes." Dawson, who had been silent through this entire exchange with the particular silence of a man processing a significant recalibration, said, "The stress chute." Everyone looked at him. "At Lejeune," he said. "Before deployment, the stress chute scores." He looked at Emma with something on his face that was not comfortable, but was at least honest. "That wasn't a fluke." "No," Emma said. "None of it was." "No." He sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a second, looked back at her. "I said you were lucky." "You did. Multiple times." "Yes." He held her gaze. I was wrong about that." It came out flat and without decoration, which was the only way she'd have accepted it, and she thought he probably knew that. She gave him a small nod that acknowledged the statement without making more of it than it was. Vasquez looked between them with the expression of a man who had caught the edge of a longer story and was filing it for later. He picked up his pen for the 3rd time. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk about the north exit shot." The debrief ran 90 minutes. When it ended, Vasquez asked Emma and Kane to stay. The room emptied. Dawson left last, glancing back once at Emma as he went through the door. The glance had something in it she didn't have an immediate category for. Not admiration exactly, not apology exactly, something adjacent to both, something that would probably resolve into one or the other over time. Vasquez stood up and walked to the map on the wall and stood with his back to them for a moment, in the way that people sometimes needed to think with their backs turned. "The bag," he said, without turning around. "You know what was in it." "Documents and a hard drive," Kane said. "SOCOM element confirmed it. Al-Badri was moving his operational materials." "If he'd made it to the street, he wouldn't have." Vasquez turned. He looked at Kane, then at Emma. "No, he wouldn't have." He came back to the table and sat down. "Staff Sergeant Collins, I'm going to ask you something and I need a straight answer." "Okay. Why comms?" She looked at him. It was a question she'd answered for herself 100 times, but answering it for someone else in this room, in this context, on this day, required a different kind of access to the answer. "Because I needed to know I was something on my own," she said, "without the name." Vasquez didn't respond immediately. He looked at the table, looked at his hands. "And now?" She thought about her father's letter in her jacket pocket, the words she'd read 3 times in a storage unit and twice in a bunk at TQ and once more last night in the dark. "Now I think he was right about something," she said, which was that there's a difference between humility and concealment. She paused. "I was past the line." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. 3 Marines are alive because you were past the line." She didn't answer that. It wasn't something she'd processed yet, and she wasn't going to perform processing she hadn't done. Kane, beside her, cleared his throat. "Sir, what happens with the after-action report?" Vasquez looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she was deployed as a comms asset. She engaged as a precision shooter. I authorized it in the field based on tactical necessity, which I'll stand behind, but the paperwork is going to ask questions that require answers." "The paperwork will reflect what happened accurately," Vasquez said. Staff Sergeant Collins responded to a deteriorating tactical situation by employing a capability that she possessed, and that was the deciding factor in protecting both combat and civilian personnel and in neutralizing the target. He looked at Emma. "That's what happened." "Roger, sir," Kane said. "Any other questions about the report?" Silence. "Good." Vasquez stood. He looked at Emma one more time with the particular look of a senior person who has just located someone they intend to remember. "Get some sleep, Staff Sergeant. We'll have more to discuss tomorrow." She stood. "Yes, sir." She followed Kane out, but the hallway outside the briefing room was empty and low-lit and smelled like the rest of the base. Kane walked 2 steps ahead of her and then stopped and turned around. He had an expression that was not quite anything she had words for. Not anger, not apology, not pure professional acknowledgement. Something that was trying to be all 3 at once and not entirely succeeding. "Collins. Gunny." He looked at her for a moment. 14 months, he said, "at Lejeune." "Yes." "And I never—" He stopped. Started again. "I never looked at you." She held his gaze, said nothing. "That's on me," he said. "Gunny, you assessed the information you had. I had your qual scores. I had your performance reviews. I had you in the same room with me for 14 months. His jaw tightened slightly. "I decided what you were before I looked. That's not an assessment. That's a bias." She could have made it easier for him. She chose not to, because making it easier would have been dishonest, and he didn't deserve dishonesty just because honesty was uncomfortable. "Yes," she said. "It was." He took that, didn't flinch from it. "I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry and expect that to land as anything useful." "It doesn't," she said. "But I hear it." He nodded. He seemed to be working through something else. "Your father, when did he pass?" "I found out 6 days ago. JAG notification." She paused. "I haven't called them back yet." Kane's expression shifted. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic person, but something in it softened by a degree. "You should do that." "I will, when the mission tempo allows." He looked at her like he was going to say something else, and then decided against it. He turned and walked down the hallway. 3 steps. He stopped again without turning around. At the stress shoot, he said. The last relay. You put 5 rounds in a group I wouldn't have been embarrassed by on a static range. Under full combat load, elevated heart rate, immediately after a 400-meter sprint. She waited. I noted it, he said. I saw the scores. I told myself you were steady under pressure and moved on. A pause. I should have asked more questions. He started walking again. Gunny, she said. He stopped. You asked the right ones today, she said. When it mattered. He stood still for a moment. Then he kept walking. She found Dawson at the vehicle yard at 1900, sitting on the hood of an MRAP and eating an MRE with the mechanical attention of someone eating because the body needed fuel rather than because food sounded like anything. The sun was down, and the base was doing its evening shift into the different operational rhythm of darkness. Quieter on the surface, more active underneath. He saw her coming and didn't pretend he hadn't. She stopped about 6 feet from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. How's Kowalski? She said. Flown to Balad. Surgeon said he keeps the arm. Dawson set the MRE down on the hood beside him. He was asking about you. What about me? He wanted to know if the same person who told him to get flat on the floor was the one who'd cleared the building. He paused. I told him yes. She looked at the vehicle yard, the dark shapes of MRAPs and trucks, arranged in the organized geometry of a motor pool, the kind of order that military environments imposed on equipment as a proxy for the control they couldn't fully impose on anything else. I owe you an apology, Dawson said. A real one, not the one I gave you in the debrief room. She looked at him. You gave me one. I gave you a tactical acknowledgement. That's different. He picked up the MRE, looked at it, put it back down. I've been running my mouth about my scores and my reputation and my ability since the day you showed up at Lejeune, in front of you, at your expense. And I did it because you were easy to dismiss. He stopped. I'm not proud of that. Emma leaned against the vehicle beside him without quite getting on the hood. You're not the first. That doesn't help. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. Your father was Ghost Collins. Yes. And you never told anyone. No. He looked at her with the expression of a man genuinely trying to understand something. Why? I mean, that name carries weight. You could have used it. That's why, she said. He held her gaze, and then something in his face shifted as the logic arrived. He nodded slowly. You wanted to be your own thing. I wanted to know if I was my own thing. And? She thought about this morning, about the adjacent rooftop and the scope and 3 shots that had each been their own decision, made under their own conditions, with no one's name attached to them except hers. Yeah, she said. I think I got that answer. Dawson was quiet. He looked at his hands, at the MRE, at some middle distance that probably wasn't in the vehicle yard. I'm a good shot, he said. I know I am. I've worked for it. You are, she said. That's true. But this morning on that rooftop, he stopped. I couldn't locate the second-floor shooter. I couldn't get the angle. I had the roof element, and then I was blown, and then I was effectively useless for the last 3 minutes of that engagement. He said it without self-pity, which was the correct way to say it, but without self-protection either. And you were doing all of it, from a position I didn't even know you had, with a rifle no one knew about, after already keeping the comms net solid for the entire mission. She said nothing. I kept thinking, the whole ride back, I kept thinking about every time I said something at Lejeune. He looked at her. You never said a word back. No. Why not? She thought about how to answer that honestly, because it didn't matter enough to spend energy on. He took a breath. Let it out. That's worse, actually. I know. He smiled, briefly and without pleasure. Yeah. He picked up the MRE again, and this time actually ate some of it. What happens now, with you? Vasquez was looking at you like, I don't know, she said. You think they'll change your billet? I think there are going to be conversations. She paused. I think I'll have opinions about those conversations. Good. He said it with a directness that surprised her slightly. You should. She looked at him. He was staring at the motor pool, chewing, thinking about something. Dawson. He looked at her. You called the shot on the roof element correctly. You engaged immediately when Kane gave the order. That created the window I needed. She said it because it was true, and because he deserved the truth in the same direction she'd received it. The east window was possible because you pulled their attention. He held her gaze. Something in him settled fractionally. Not vanity satisfied, just something returning to its correct position. We worked it, he said. We worked it, she agreed. He nodded. She pushed off the vehicle and started back toward the billets. Collins. She turned. For what it's worth. He looked at her steadily. I'm glad you were there. She held his gaze for a moment. So am I, she said. She walked back across the vehicle yard in the dark base air that was cooling rapidly the way desert air did when the sun released its hold on it, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour, the sky doing the thing it did in desert environments, opening up, the stars arriving in quantity that you never saw through American light pollution, dense and indifferent and very old. She walked under them without looking up. She had things to do. The JAG attorney's name was Hendricks, and he answered on the second ring even though it was past 11 at night on the East Coast, which told Emma that he'd been waiting for the call, or that he was the kind of person who answered his phone regardless of the hour. She was using the satellite comm room, the one place on the base with reliable enough connectivity for a call that wasn't operationally necessary. Staff Sergeant Collins, Hendricks said. Thank you for calling. I've been in the field, she said. I'm sorry for the delay. Please don't apologize. I understand completely. A pause in which she could hear him arranging papers. I want to first say that I'm very sorry for your loss. Your father was, well, he was a remarkable man, and I know this is not easy. Tell me what I need to know, Emma said. He told her. It took 12 minutes. She listened without writing anything down because she had no notebook in front of her, and because the information was the kind that either landed and stayed or didn't, and this kind landed. Her father had died 3 weeks ago. Cardiac event, at the ranch in Montana. He'd been alone. A neighbor had found him 2 days later. He'd had his affairs in complete order. Everything documented, everything assigned, every legal instrument signed and filed with the precision of a man who'd spent his career preparing for contingencies. The ranch, the equipment, a trust that had been accumulating for 18 years. There's a letter, Hendricks said. Not the one in the storage unit. He mentioned you had that one. A separate letter with the estate documentation. He asked me to read it to you when we spoke. Emma was quiet. If you're ready, Hendricks said. She looked at the wall of the satellite comm room, at the equipment racks and the blinking status lights, and the acoustic foam that covered the walls to reduce echo on the calls that went through this room every day. Go ahead, she said. Hendricks read it. It was shorter than the storage unit letter. Her father had always communicated more efficiently in formal situations than informal ones, which was a characteristic she recognized in herself and had never thought to trace to its origin until this moment. He said that he was proud of her in ways he'd been poor at expressing in person, that he had followed her career through channels she didn't know existed and wouldn't ask about, that the scores she'd posted at Lejeune had made him laugh with a specific joy that he'd had trouble describing to the JAG attorney when the letter was drafted, which was why he hadn't tried to describe it in the letter, that the ranch was hers, that the equipment in the storage unit was hers, that the discipline he'd given her was the only thing he'd been certain, all his life, was worth passing on. And then one more line. The world has enough people who are impressive in training. It has always been short on people who are present when it matters. You were always going to be the second kind. Hendricks stopped reading. The satellite comm room was very quiet. Emma sat with her hand flat on the table in front of her and looked at the blinking status lights and did not move for a moment. Staff Sergeant Collins, Hendricks said gently. I'm here, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady, which was different from it being steady naturally, but the distinction didn't matter from the outside. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "There's no urgency on any of the estate items." "I'll call you next week," she said, "when I'm back stateside." "Of course. And Staff Sergeant," a pause. "He asked me to tell you one more thing that he didn't put in the letter." She waited. "He said, tell her the Montana range is still zeroed. Tell her I never changed it." Emma pressed her lips together. "Thank you," she said. "Tell him—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Thank you, Mr. Hendricks." She ended the call. She sat in the satellite comm room for a while, not doing anything. The status lights blinked on their regular cycles, indifferent and constant, the way equipment ran when it was working correctly, without drama, without announcement, just the steady performance of function. She thought about Montana, about a range in a backfield at the edge of a valley, zeroed for distances that most people never tried. She thought about her father standing at the edge of a ridgeline with his back to the camera. She thought about standing in her own light. After a while, she got up. She checked the comm systems. Habit, reflex, the thing her hands did in comm rooms, found them all green, logged out, and turned off the light. She walked back to the billets in the cool desert night. Tomorrow there would be more. More missions, more briefings, more conversations she didn't know the shape of yet. With Vasquez, with Kane, with whoever above Vasquez had been copied on an after-action report describing a communications specialist who had fired 3 shots from a personal weapon at distances that would require explanation. There would be questions she would have to answer now because the time for not answering them was over. She was not afraid of those questions. She had been afraid of them for 4 years. She was done being afraid of them. The barracks door was ahead of her. She pushed it open and went inside and found her bunk in the dark and sat on the edge of it and took her father's letter from her jacket pocket and held it for a moment without opening it. She didn't need to open it. She had it memorized. She put it back in her pocket, lay down, and closed her eyes. Outside, the base ran its night cycle. Vehicles, radio traffic, the distant percussion of something happening somewhere in the city that was always happening somewhere in the city. Emma Collins lay in her bunk and listened to it and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like herself. Fully, without reservation, like the person she'd been hiding in plain sight, like the person her father had always known she was. She slept 6 hours without dreaming, which was the best sleep she'd had since Jacksonville. And when the alarm pulled her up at 04:30, the first thing she was aware of was that the letter was still in her jacket pocket, and the jacket was on the chair beside her bunk, and her father was still dead, and none of that had changed overnight, which she had not expected to change, but which the body checked for anyway, the way the body always checked, because that was what the body did in the early hours after loss. It ran the verification again, hoping for a different result, and then processed the same result. And then got up. She got up. Yij. The conversation with Vasquez happened at 800 in his office, which was a slightly larger plywood room than the briefing space, with a desk that had too many things on it and a single window that looked out at the motor pool. He had coffee. He didn't offer her any, which she registered without offense. He was already 3 problems deep when she arrived. She could tell by the way he was holding a pen without writing anything. He gestured at the chair across from the desk. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, the focused look of a man organizing his opening. "I talked to my CO last night," he said, "and he talked to someone above him. And the short version of what came out of that is that there are people who want to have a conversation with you that is above my pay grade to facilitate." Emma held his gaze. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that involves your marksmanship profile, your training background, and what you want to do with the remaining portion of your career." He set down the pen. "You're 4 years in. You've got at least a decade ahead of you if you want it. The question on the table is what that decade looks like." "What are my options?" He leaned back. "Formally, you'd need to go through a selection and assessment process. The specifics depend on which door opens. But what I can tell you is that the after-action report from yesterday was read by people who do not normally read battalion-level AARs, and the reaction was significant." Emma looked at the window. The motor pool. an MRAP with its hood up, and two Marines leaning over the engine in the way of people diagnosing something that was misbehaving. "I went into communications," she said, "because I wanted something that was mine." "I know. I'm not sure I want to walk through a door that turns me into my father's legacy." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something that's outside my lane?" "Go ahead." "Those are different things now." He waited until she looked at him. "Yesterday morning, you made 3 shots under conditions that most trained snipers would find challenging on their best day. You made them after maintaining a communications net that kept that element coherent through a deteriorating situation. You made them with a personal weapon you'd been carrying quietly for days without telling anyone, which means you'd already made a private decision about being ready." He paused. "That's not your father's legacy. That's yours. You built that. He gave you tools. What you did with them. That was you." She looked at him. He was not saying it to be generous. He was saying it because he meant it, which was a different thing, and she knew the difference. "What's the timeline?" she said. "Flexible. There's no pressure. When we redeploy, you'll have conversations. You can say no to all of it and go back to comms, and that will be a legitimate choice that I'll respect." He picked up the pen again. "But I think you already know what you're going to do." She looked at the motor pool. The 2 Marines had found whatever was wrong with the MRAP. She could tell by the change in their posture, the shift from diagnostic to corrective. One of them reached into the engine with both hands and adjusted something, and the other one stood back watching. "Yeah," she said. "I think I do." Kowalski came back from Balad 4 days later, which was faster than anyone expected, and which the surgeon apparently expressed strong opinions about that Kowalski had listened to politely and then disregarded. His left arm was in a sling, and he was on limited duty, and he was also, visibly and without apology, not someone who was going to lie in a bed in Balad when his platoon was in Fallujah. He found Emma in the comms room on the afternoon of his return. She was running a routine net check, the daily maintenance work that continued regardless of what else was happening, because the radios didn't care about operational tempo or after-action reports or conversations with captains. He knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said. "The surgeon's opinion has been noted," he said. He came in and sat down in the chair beside the bench with the careful movement of a man managing a specific area of discomfort. "How's the net?" "Green." "Good." He looked around the room, at the equipment, at Emma's notebook open on the bench. "I wanted to say something to you." "Kowalski." "I know. You're going to tell me I don't owe you anything, or that you were just doing what the situation required, or some other version of that." He met her eyes. "Let me say it anyway." She put down her pen. "I was behind that door," he said, "with Ortega and those civilians. When the east window opened up, I heard the rounds hit the doorframe, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I was 22 years old, and I thought that was it. I genuinely thought that was it." He looked at his arm in the sling, and then it went quiet. And Ortega said the position was clear, and later I found out why it was clear. He looked at her. "So, thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. "You held the pressure dressing the whole time," she said. "After Ortega applied it. You kept the right tension, and you stayed calm enough that the civvies in that room didn't panic. That mattered." He blinked. You did your job," she said. "Under the conditions. That's what I did. That's what we both did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, in the way of someone accepting something rather than agreeing with it. "You're different than I thought you were," he said. "At Lejeune, I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said, not unkindly. "Most people did." "Yeah." He stood, managing the movement carefully. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be sorry about it," she said. "Just update the model going forward." He almost smiled. "Roger that, Staff Sergeant." He left. She sat with the net check log in front of her and finished it line by line, and logged it and closed the notebook. She thought about 22 years old and the feeling of thinking, that's it. She had felt something adjacent to that on the adjacent rooftop, settling into the prone with rounds coming from 2 positions and a 4-minute window and a 3rd engagement she hadn't planned for. Not fear, or not only fear, More the very clear, very clean awareness that the margin was thin and what happened in the next 3 minutes was going to be consequential in one direction or another. She had not frozen. She had not hesitated. She had worked the problem the way she'd been built to work it. She was still working out how she felt about all of that. She suspected it was going to take longer than 4 days. The remaining 3 weeks of the deployment were not quiet. No deployment to this city in this period was quiet. But they were different for Emma in a way that was internal rather than circumstantial. The work was the same work. Net checks, frequency plans, equipment maintenance. She went on 2 more missions as communication support and performed both with the same competence she'd brought to every previous mission, the competence that had always been there and had simply not been the thing people noticed. What changed was the noticing. Not dramatic, not sudden. More the gradual shift that happens when a group of people updates their model of someone, not all at once, but incrementally, observation by observation, until the person they thought was background furniture is just a person they see clearly. Perez asked her a question about rifle optics during a maintenance period. She answered it. He came back with a follow-up question the next day. One of the Special Operations Marines, the one who had moved involuntarily when she'd said her father's name in the debrief, introduced himself properly on day 6. His name was Garza. He was careful and direct, and he said without preamble, "I worked with your father in 2009. He was the best I've ever seen at distance." A pause. "You're better." Emma looked at him. "You've seen me shoot 3 times. I've seen enough." She thought about what to say to that and settled on nothing, which he seemed to accept. He nodded and walked away. She stood with that for a while. Not with pride exactly, with something harder to name, the feeling of a thing finally being said out loud that had been true for a long time and silent for almost as long. Kane came to find her on the last night before the redeployment flight. She was on the perimeter road, running her 3 miles in the dark, the way she'd run them every morning since they'd arrived. But this was evening, the last evening, and she was running them differently. Not slower, not faster, just with the particular quality of attention you gave to something you were doing for the last time in a specific place. He was standing at the 1-mile mark when she came around the curve. Not running, just standing there with his arms crossed, which meant he'd come to talk rather than join her, which meant he'd found her location and waited for her, which meant whatever he'd come to say had been thought through. She slowed to a walk when she reached him. They fell in together, walking, the base spread out around them in its night configuration. "I put something in my portion of the AAR, he said. "I want you to know." "What?" "I noted that the route change at the first alley was your call, your read of the threat indicator." He kept his eyes forward. "And I noted that the tactical decision to retrieve the personal weapon was mine, but that the capability assessment, the judgment that you could make those shots under those conditions, was yours. And that you were right." Emma walked beside him. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," he said. "Inaccurate records are a disservice to everyone who reads them afterward, including the people who write them." She said nothing. "I also noted," he said slower now, like he was being careful with the words, "that the proficiency evident in your performance was present during the pre-deployment period and was not adequately identified or utilized by the command element." He paused. "That's me. I'm the command element. Gunny, I'm not looking for you to make this easier for me, Collins." She closed her mouth. "I made assumptions," he said, "about what you were, about what you could do. I made them early, and I didn't revisit them because revisiting assumptions about people is uncomfortable, and I had other things demanding my attention, and it was easier not to." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Those assumptions could have gotten people killed yesterday. Kowalski almost died because we didn't have the right person in the right role, and the only reason we had the right person at all is because the situation got bad enough that there was no other option." He turned to look at her. "That's not good enough. That's not the kind of NCO I want to be." The base hummed around them, distant vehicles, the low frequency of generators. "You adjusted when it mattered," Emma said. "You made the call." "Late," he said. "I made it late." She looked at him. He was not performing contrition. He didn't have the nature for performance. He was doing what she'd watched him do with everything else, assessing the situation accurately and stating the assessment plainly. "Then do it differently next time," she said. "That's all there is." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. They started walking again. After a while, he said, "Vasquez told me about the conversations coming, the doors that are open." "Yeah." "You thinking about it?" "Yes." "And?" She looked at the perimeter road ahead of them, the way it curved around the north edge of the base and disappeared into the dark beyond the lights. "I've been hiding what I am for 4 years," she said. "I told myself it was about building something on my own terms, and it was. But somewhere in there it also became about not having to be responsible for it, not having to be the person people needed to be capable." She paused. "That's not humility. That's avoidance." Kane walked beside her without interrupting. "I'm done avoiding it," she said. He nodded. A single, clean nod. "Good." They finished the loop in silence. When they reached the point where the road met the billets, he stopped. "Collins." She turned. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it with the appropriate level of precision. He settled on, "For what it's worth, and I know it's late, you're the best shooter I've ever served with, and one of the best communicators, and I should have known that 6 months into Lejeune." She held his gaze. "It's worth something," she said. He nodded once more. He walked away. She stood there for a moment in the cooling desert air and looked at nothing in particular and let what he'd said exist in the air around her without doing anything with it. Then she went inside and finished packing. The flight back was a C-17 out of Al-Assad, 14 hours with a fuel stop that nobody talked about in a location that wasn't on the manifest, and Emma spent most of it in the web seat with her eyes closed and her mind doing the thing minds did on long flights after long deployments, processing the images and conversations and decisions in whatever order they arrived, not chronologically, not by importance, just as they came, like a machine running its own diagnostic. She thought about the adjacent rooftop, the weight of the stock against her cheek, the particular quality of stillness before a shot that was, she now understood, not the absence of feeling, but the management of all feeling, the discipline of containing it so that the one thing that needed to happen could happen. She thought about her father on the Montana ridgeline, his hand on her shoulder, not guiding, just present. She thought about Kowalski at 22, holding a pressure dressing in a room with civilians, staying calm because staying calm was what the situation needed from him. She thought about Dawson on the roof, doing his job under conditions that had gone sideways, staying professional when he could have fallen apart. She thought about Kane, standing on a perimeter road in the dark, saying the accurate thing even when the accurate thing wasn't comfortable. She thought about her father's last line. The world has always been short on people who are present when it matters. She was present. She had always been present. She was done being quiet about it. Ncham. Stateside, the conversations Vasquez had predicted happened in the order and with the people she'd expected, in offices that smelled like institutional carpet and recycled air rather than sawdust and desert dust, which was a different world with the same stakes expressed differently. She said yes. Not to everything offered. She was specific about what she wanted and what she didn't, which surprised the first officer she sat across from and did not surprise the second, who had read her file more carefully and said, midway through the conversation, "You know what you want. That's unusual at your level." "I've had time to think about it," she said. What she wanted was instruction. The specific, deliberate passing of what she knew to people who needed to know it, not because she had a name to trade on or a reputation to manage, but because she had watched Kowalski in that stairwell and Ortega keeping civilians calm and Dawson functioning professionally under blown cover. And she understood something about what training actually produced when it was done right. It produced people who were present when it mattered. It produced people who could be relied on in the rooms that required reliability. It produced people who could be invisible for years, and then, when the moment arrived, be exactly what was needed. She wanted to build more of those people. The program she was assigned to was not glamorous. It was not the role that appeared in the recruiting materials, or the kind that generated the visible career milestones that moved a person up the rank structure with maximum efficiency. It was a marksmanship and tactical integration program for Marines identified as high potential but low visibility, Exactly the category she'd occupied for 4 years. The people who fell through the cracks of a system that rewarded loudness and penalized quiet. She took it without hesitation. Dawson called her 3 weeks after redeployment. She was in Montana, at the ranch, doing the things she'd told Hendricks she would do when she got stateside, dealing with the estate, walking the property, standing in the rooms her father had lived in, and letting the fact of their emptiness become something she could carry rather than something she was avoiding. He called from a base in California where he'd been reassigned. The call connected on the second try because the cell service at the ranch was contingent on weather, and the weather that week was ambivalent. "How's the property?" he said. "Quiet," she said. She was standing on the back porch looking at the field, the range markers at 200 meters, 400, 600, the furthest at just under 1,000, all of them still there, still standing, the target frames weathered but intact. "It's good quiet." "Good." A pause on his end. "I wanted to tell you something. I requested some cross-training in comms." She waited. "I realized," he said, "that I've been a shooter who doesn't understand the net. And that's a problem. If yesterday had gone differently, if the comms had failed and I hadn't known how to troubleshoot it or what to tell you." He paused. "I should understand the whole picture." Emma looked at the range. The wind was moving through the high grass at the edge of the field, bending it in slow arcs. "That's a good decision," she said. "I thought you'd think so." Another pause. "I also talked to some of the younger Marines in the platoon about what happened, about how I'd been operating at Lejeune." She said nothing. "I told them I'd spent 14 months being loud about my abilities at the expense of paying attention to the people around me, and that it cost me information I needed." His voice was measured, not dramatic, just honest, in the deliberate way of someone who'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say. "I don't know if that landed, but I said it." "It landed," she said. "Those things land." "Yeah." A long pause. "How are you doing with your father?" She looked at the field, at the range markers, at the target frame at 1,000 yards that was barely visible in the afternoon light. "I'm okay," she said. It was true in the way that true things were true when they were also incomplete. She was okay, and she was also not finished processing it, and both things were simultaneously accurate, and she had stopped expecting them to resolve into one. "He was something," Dawson said, "from everything I've read." "He was," she agreed. "He was also just a person who was good at his job and tried to do right by his kid." She paused. "He didn't always get it right. He was in the field more than he was home. I spent a lot of years being angry about that." "Are you still?" She thought about it honestly. "No, I think I understand it better now. What it means to be the kind of person who shows up when it matters, and what that costs in the places that don't register as mattering." Dawson was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing to balance." "Yes," she said. They talked for a few more minutes about things that were easier. His new billet, her program, the bureaucratic details of reintegration that consumed the weeks after a deployment in a way that was somehow both tedious and necessary. When they said goodbye, it was without ceremony, which was the right way. She stood on the porch after the call ended and looked at the field for a long time. Then she went inside and found her father's journals in the box Hendricks had set aside. 12 of them, going back 25 years, dense with the technical observations and field notes of a man who had spent his career paying attention to a world most people never looked at closely enough to see. She sat at his desk and opened the first one. She read until dark. The first class she taught was 11 Marines, not the strongest 11 in their cohort, not the ones with the highest profiles or the most visible performance records, the ones who had been assessed as capable and overlooked, for reasons of personality, of manner, of the specific ways they failed to register in rooms full of louder people, the ones who fell between the cracks of a system that mistook visibility for value. She stood in front of them on a Monday morning at a range that smelled like gun oil and pine and the particular mineral quality of cold morning air, and she looked at them looking at her. 11 faces doing the thing faces did when they were trying to figure out who they were dealing with. And she said, "I'm Staff Sergeant Collins. I'm going to teach you to shoot. I'm going to teach you to think." And I'm going to teach you that what you are when no one is watching is exactly what you'll be when everything depends on you. So you'd better make sure those two things are the same." She let that sit for a second. Questions? No questions. Good. Let's start. She turned and walked to the firing line. Behind her, 11 Marines who had been told in various ways by various people that they were not the ones to watch, moved to follow her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. At the end of that first week, after the range had closed and the last Marine had squared away their gear and the pine tree shadows were long across the grass, Emma walked to the far end of the range alone. She stood at the 800-meter line. She thought about a rooftop in Fallujah, about a man in a window and the math of wind and distance and the particular quality of stillness that preceded the moment when everything either held or didn't. She thought about her father. She thought about 11 Marines who had spent a week being seen, clearly and without assumption, for the first time in their careers. She bent down and picked up a spent casing from the dirt, not hers, from the day's training, and turned it over in her fingers and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and walked back. The range was quiet behind her, the kind of quiet that comes after good work. Not empty, but settled, the way a room feels after something true has been said in it. She had a class to prepare for tomorrow. She had 11 people who needed what she knew. She had work to do. The most dangerous people in any room are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones who have spent years becoming capable in the silence, who show up without announcement, who work without applause, and who are simply, completely there when it matters most. The world will overlook them. The world will always overlook them, until the moment it cannot, until the moment it needs them.